We pick up the next part of our story in June 2020. Henry now for a few months lives by himself. His brother passed away about 6 to 7 months ago. On a sunny morning, Henry visits his little brother's grave and remembers a time when him and his little brother shared a funny moment. That same morning, Mason receives a new case from his lieutenant. Mason goes over the details of the case and immediately calls his brother so he can come home and they can get to work. Jason makes it to his older brother's apartment and the two go over the case and make a plan. The case turns out to be about a wanted 19-year-old named Christian Gutierrez, who goes by Chris. Mason decides to split up and have Jason check out an old partner Chris used to work with named Hector Rivera. At a clubhouse that Hector stays at sometimes, Chris and Hector play pool and are hanging out. After a moment, Hector gets a text from his cousin Henry, which makes the two friends stop playing and leave the clubhouse. On the way out, they run into Jason, who tries to stop Hector to question him, but before he can, Chris comes out of nowhere and tackles him. Chris takes off and gets in his car, getting it started. Hector and Jason have a small fight, ending with Hector throwing Jason over his shoulder onto the ground. Hector and Chris take off in the car, leaving Jason watching them get away. In another part of the city, a guy named Johnny Diaz receives a call from an unknown person. Johnny is a hitman of sorts and is looking for Chris so he can take him out and get money for his assassination. Henry finally comes home after a while of being out in the city. He remembers the time when he tried to teach his little brother how to fight, but Henry accidentally punched him in the face, making him bleed. After failing to catch Hector and Chris, Jason decides to get a haircut and go home. He takes out his growing anger on his punching bag when he has free time. Mason makes it home after searching Chris's old neighborhood. When he gets to the front door, he realizes that it's open and enters the apartment with caution. After a moment of searching, a burglar comes out and tries to kill Mason, but Mason handles him with ease and arrests him immediately. Chris pulls into an abandoned parking lot where Michael shows up and they do a quick gun deal. Jason meets up with Michael about an hour later, where Michael reveals to him that he left the tracker in Chris's car. Jason gets mad at Michael for trying to help him, so Michael gets mad also and leaves Jason there by himself. Hector comes to see Henry and sees how he's doing. Johnny shows up a minute later trying to see if the cousins know where Chris is. Hector ends up getting mad at Johnny and the two start to fight. Henry tries to stop Hector from fighting, but then the two end up jumping Johnny and leaving him there. That night, Jason texts Michael about the tracker. Michael sends the information over and Jason starts to see where the tracker is. The next day, on July 1st, Henry comes out of his apartment. On his way out, he sees a tracker and examines it. He gets a text from Chris letting him know to get rid of the tracker. Henry becomes curious who the tracker belongs to, so he takes it with him to lure out whoever's searching for it. Later, Jason figures out where the tracker is. Henry comes out from his hiding spot and sees the cop standing out in the open. Henry takes his pistol out and shoots at the cop, trying to hit him, but he misses his shot. Jason gets to cover while Henry takes off running. In another part of the city, Mason goes to arrest Johnny to question him about Chris because they used to work together. Mason and Johnny start to fight, but Johnny gets away from Mason. Henry continues to run away from Jason, then hides. Jason keeps running, but Henry comes out of nowhere and the two start to fight. After a moment, Jason gets his pistol and shoots Henry in the chest. Henry starts to lose all his senses and then falls to the ground, bleeding out from his gunshot wound. Mason eventually arrests Johnny after a small fight and starts to walk him out of the dried up river. Jason walks over to knock out Henry, while in another part of the city, Chris gets away for good. A few seconds after, Jason calls an ambulance. He gets Henry into the ambulance and the EMTs get to work trying to keep Henry alive. Henry makes it to the hospital where he'll be taken care of and gets surgery for his gunshot wound. At the same time, Jeffrey gets his things ready and comes down from the mountains. He's ready to go look for his little brother Robert. But at that same moment, Robert finally comes home and is there to stay. About a month later, now in August, Jason comes to see Henry. Henry fully recovers from his injuries and meets with Jason in the hospital parking lot. Henry turns out to have lost some of his memory and can't remember who Jason is exactly. Jason takes advantage of this and says that he was the officer who was the first to the scene when Henry's little brother died. Henry believes Jason, and then Jason proceeds to tell Henry about a deal. Jason's deal is if Henry helps him catch a guy named Noah Garcia, he will help Henry find his little brother's murderer. Henry thinks about it for a moment, then agrees to help Jason. After that, Jason drops Henry off at his apartment so he can relax while Jason goes home to work on a different case. The next day, Michael wakes up after dreaming about when he left to go help Jeffrey and Robert last year in August. Michael takes a shower to get rid of his thoughts, but then thinks about his girlfriend Liz, who he hasn't seen in a year, fearing that if he goes back home, she might get hurt. At the same time, Jason is taking his anger out on his punching bag when he gets a call from his brother Mason. Jason sits down and talks to Mason for a while, and then he goes inside. He starts to work on the new case involving a convicted felon named Jackson Harris, who goes by Jack. Jason realizes that Jack and Michael have some violent history together. About an hour later, Michael is getting ready to go back to Liz's place. He packs everything he needs in his gym bag and then leaves his apartment quickly. Now on a mountain in the city, Jack Harris is target practicing. He shoots a bunch of cans and cups without missing a shot. After a moment, he leaves to go find Michael. In another part of the city, Michael's girlfriend Liz is sketching in her room. She remembers a time last year where Michael got a text and left the room abruptly. Back at Jason's house, he tries to call Michael to warn him about Jack. When Michael doesn't answer, Jason suits up and leaves his house to go see Michael at his place. Jack eventually makes it to Michael's apartment and searches the place. When he doesn't find anything, Jason shows up, forcing Jack to hide. After a moment, the two end up outside running around. When Jason drops Jack and tries to arrest him, Jack hits Jason in the face with a rock. This gives Jack a chance to run to get away from Jason. Now at a public park, Michael goes to meet a drug dealer by the name of Byron Fernandez. Michael and Byron do a quick deal, ending with Michael buying some medication. On his way out, Michael gets watched by Jack. Jack stupidly tries to take out Byron before he goes for Michael. Byron ends up fighting Jack and then getting away from the park quickly. Michael makes it to another park in a different part of the city. He sits there contemplating and then remembers when he left Liz's place to go help Jeffrey and Robert last year. Jason shows up at the same park and starts to talk with Michael. He convinces him to come with them so they can talk about Jack. The next morning, Michael and Jason decide to talk and start their plan to catch Jack. Eventually, Jack finally shows up in the hills. He looks around for a moment, then Jason comes out of nowhere. The two get into a small fight, but Jack ends up almost knocking out Jason completely. Michael distracts Jack, making him grab Jason's gun, and he runs after him. While Jack looks around, Michael and Jason show up, both holding weapons. Jack then realizes the magazine is empty and drops the gun. Jason arrests Jack and takes him away. A few hours later, Michael makes it to Liz's place. The two embrace and are happy to finally see each other again after a year. In the afternoon, Jason makes it home and gives Henry's car back. The two say goodbye for now, but will meet again in a few weeks. Weeks go by, and it's now late September. Henry starts to work on the Noah Garcia case with Jason. This is his test to become a police officer. Henry goes to see his little brother's grave again before he starts to search for Noah Garcia. At the same time, Byron goes to talk to a buyer. The two start off talking normally until it escalates into an argument. The two end up fighting and Byron beats up the buyer till he's all bloody and knocked out. About an hour later, Henry makes it to Noah's apartment. He gets to the front door but can't get inside. But at the front door, there's a camel backpack. Henry takes out a tracking device and activates it. He then puts it inside the backpack and leaves. Later, Henry and Jason meet. Jason agrees to track Noah's backpack for Henry and lets him know he'll tell him the information later. Back at Noah's apartment, Byron shows up and finds Noah's backpack. He puts it on and takes him with him and leaves in his SUV. In another part of the city, Isabella waits for a bus. Henry pulls up in front of her out of nowhere, and then he convinces her to get in the car. In an empty parking lot of a local mall, Byron meets up with his old friend Jacob Perez. Byron lets Jacob know about the tracker he found in the backpack, so he gives it to him. Jacob becomes curious about the tracker, so he stays in the parking lot and waits for whoever is looking for it. Henry drops Isabella off at her older brother Brian's house. After Isabella gets out of the car, she thanks Henry for the ride, and he leaves. A few hours later, Henry has a vision of his little brother at home. When that happens, Jason finally sends the information of the tracker and Henry leaves. Later at the parking lot, Henry figures out where the tracking device is. He pulls up next to a car that has Jacob sitting in it. Jacob sees Henry and immediately takes off driving away. Henry drives off chasing Jacob, thinking that he's Noah Garcia. Eventually, Jacob leads Henry into the middle of nowhere. He leads him into the woods and then knocks Henry out with a wooden mallet. Henry ends up having a vision where he wakes up on a mountain. He gets up and feels the wind going through his hair and clothes. He seems to be at peace, standing there, looking out at the beautiful mountains and the sky. In the afternoon, the buyer from earlier makes it to Noah's apartment. He gets to the front door and sees that the backpack is gone. He nervously leaves the area without the backpack. Early the next morning, Jason is taking his anger out on his punching bag again. He notices Henry hasn't come by yet and then becomes nervous. He looks at something on his phone and then leaves the area quickly. On a mountain in the city, Jacob sits Henry down against an old concrete ledge and gets ready to kill him. But when Henry wakes up, the two start to fight and then have a chase. Eventually, Henry gets away and hides from Jacob. Jacob doesn't find Henry for a while, but then Henry comes out of nowhere and the two start to fight. The fight ends with Jacob just barely getting Henry stunned and getting away from him before he recovers. Later that morning, the buyer goes into the woods to meet with someone, but ends up running into Jason, who is there to arrest him because he's Noah Garcia. Noah realizes he has nowhere to go, but he tries to run away from Jason, hoping to lose him. Eventually, Jason catches up to Noah and the two start to fight. Jason beats up Noah and breaks his arm. Noah starts to run his mouth, and Jason lets his anger get the better of him, and he kills him with a gunshot to the heart. A few weeks later, Henry comes by to see Isabella. He tries to see how she's doing, but Isabella tries to end the conversation quickly. Before he can leave though, Isabella comes back and asks for his help. At the same time, Byron meets with Hector on an empty road. The two talk about where Michael is, then Hector takes a pistol out. The two guys fight, ending with Hector killing Byron. Now in October, Jacob and his partner have come up with a plan to get revenge for his little brother named William. Jacob heads over to an apartment to pick up a white box that he will use for later. About an hour later, Jacob heads over to the cemetery. He visits his little brother's grave and leaves his favorite card there for him. After a moment, Jacob leaves to get to work on his revenge. The next morning, Brian is out on his morning run. He gets home after his run and checks his mailbox, finding a white box with a red question mark on it. Brian takes out a tape recorder and listens to it. He doesn't recognize the voice, but he immediately starts to follow its instructions and leaves to get ready. In another part of the city, Henry and Isabella are looking for Isabella's friend. The two end up leaving after she gets a call from her brother, telling her to come home. Jacob goes out into an old dried-up river. He collects a duffel bag full of guns and ammo and gear that his partner left for him. Jacob takes the duffel bag with him and leaves the area quickly, ready to use the gear for later. Eventually, Brian makes it to the abandoned school him and Isabella would hang out at as kids. When he gets there, he finds another tape with more instructions and that same unrecognizable voice. Right when he's about to leave, Brian sees what's spray painted on the side of the building. Henry goes to Jason's house and tries to call him, but he doesn't answer. He goes to Jason's front door and sees some gear that Jason left out for him, since Henry is now a police officer. In the woods, the shape turns out to still be alive after Jason shot him. He gets his old white mask and a metal baseball bat, getting ready to go out and get his revenge. Brian makes it into the woods and finds another tape. This one makes him angry because it talks about how he treats his little sister Isabella. He throws the tape in anger and breaks it. On his way out of the woods, Isabella gets there and the two start to leave together. Out of nowhere, the shape comes out and chases the two siblings. They both run over the bridge so fast and get onto the dirt driveway. Henry pulls up just in time for the two siblings to jump in his car and drive off. The shape watches the trio drive away harmless. Michael comes back to his old apartment. He looks around for a moment, then finds something he needs. On his way out, he notices the text he got from Brian an hour earlier. Michael immediately drops what he needed and goes out to help Brian. Somewhere in the woods, Jacob is scouting the area. He walks down a path that leads to a dead end where he can't hear a lot. While Jacob walks, he notices someone is watching him. After a moment, the shape tries to attack Jacob, but he ends up shooting him and killing him. Henry tries to call Jason again, but he doesn't answer. Henry hangs up, not wanting to leave a message, and puts his phone away. He makes it back to his car where he left Isabella and Brian, but Isabella is gone. Henry and Brian talk for a moment, then Henry agrees to take Brian to a park for the next clue he needs. At the park, Brian finds a wallet with $2 in it. The bills have some threatening words written in red ink. Brian drops the wallet and the bills and leaves the park quickly, not caring about the clues anymore. Jacob watches Brian walk away and starts to follow him. Brian walks for a while trying to think of what to do next. Jacob follows Brian into the hiking path and knocks him out with a headlock. Now at the abandoned school, Isabella finds what's spray painted on the wall and freaks out. Jacob comes out of nowhere and knocks her out with a headlock and throws her into his car, ready to take her to the woods with Brian. At Brian's house, Michael starts to look around. He looks through the gate that leads to the backyard but doesn't see anyone. He calls Brian to see if he picks up, but Michael gets sent straight to voicemail. That night, Henry is taking a nap in his car. Out of nowhere, a loud bang wakes him up. Henry gets out of his car to investigate and he finds a tape for him. The voice tells Henry to not look for Isabella or Brian, but Henry doesn't listen. At the same time, Michael starts to figure out where Brian is. He starts to track Brian's phone to see where it was last. The next morning, Isabella wakes up in the woods. She finds trees with yellow arrows pointing where to go. Isabella starts to follow the arrows, but only after she arms herself with a red switchblade. Michael figures out the location of Brian's phone is in the woods. He goes there and starts to look around for any clues to see where Brian is. Henry figures out Isabella's in the woods using his tracker. Before he can get too far, he finds the shape's dead body, with blood everywhere and the duffel bag full of guns. Eventually, Henry finds Isabella and gets her to safety. Brian wakes up and looks around, realizing he's in the woods. He walks around for a moment to see where he is and yells for help. But before he can do anything, Jacob shows up from afar and shoots at Brian. Michael finds a white box with a question mark on it. He takes out a police badge that looks just like Jason's and realizes Jason might be behind all of this. Jason turns out to be Jacob's partner, and the two came up with this plan to kill Brian for the murder of Jacob's little brother, William. After a moment of thinking, Michael puts the badge away and takes his pistol out and starts looking for Brian. Eventually, Michael finds his best friend's lifeless body on the ground and no one else in sight.